I had 86 missed calls on my phone when I woke up that morning. 86. The kind of number you only see when something has gone catastrophically wrong. Most of them were from the plant. A few from my boss. The last one, just after 3 a.m., was from a block number that I knew belonged to the regional director. My name is Michael Harris, 38 years old, shift supervisor at a steel fabrication plant in Indiana. For 12 years, I'd been the guy they called when a line jammed, when a furnace overheated, when a shipment was stuck in the loading dock and the trucker was threatening to leave. I'd solved problems no one else even noticed. And 2 days earlier, I had been told to my face that I wasn't ready for promotion. When my boss said those words, I didn't argue. I nodded, clocked out on time, and walked out of the building without another word. On the surface, I was calm. Inside, something had shifted. 12 years of sacrifices, 12 years of missed birthdays, 12 years of being the one to step in when the alarms went off at 2 in the morning. And I was still not ready. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't draft an angry email. I just sat in my truck in the parking lot for a while, staring at the rows of sodium lights glowing over the factory roof. Then I started my engine, drove home, and for the first time in years, I slept through the night. No pager, no emergency call, no dragging myself back to the floor because someone else couldn't handle it. 2 days later, the silence shattered. The plant descended into chaos. The blast furnace tripped twice, halting production. The coolant system failed because no one noticed the warning alarms buried in the diagnostics panel. Shipments stacked up at the docks. Half the crew walked out by lunch. And the person they had always relied on, the one who knew every shortcut, every workaround, every undocumented detail of the system, wasn't there. I didn't pick up the phone. Not once. I just watched the missed calls stack higher, each one proof that the words I'd heard from my boss weren't just wrong, they were insulting. Not ready? Without me, they couldn't even keep the place running for 48 hours. The truth was, I hadn't left in anger. I'd left with a plan forming in the back of my mind. I'd spent too many years documenting everything, memorizing every quirk in the system, building redundancies they didn't even realize existed. I wasn't reckless. I was methodical. And now, for the first time, I was letting the machine run without me. What they didn't understand was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something else. Something colder. Something that would prove, once and for all, just how ready I really was. When the 86 call rolled in, I set the phone face down on the table and let it buzz itself to silence. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat there with a notebook open in front of me, pen balanced in my hand. 3 words on the top of the page: observe, record, act. That had always been my way. Not emotion, not noise, just structure. I was the guy who could rebuild a process from memory because I'd already run the simulation in my head a dozen times. That's why the plant had leaned on me for years. And that's why they were unraveling without me now. I thought back to that meeting with my boss, Carl. He hadn't even looked me in the eye, just flipped through some papers on his desk and said, "Mike, we don't think you're ready for a management role. Not yet." Like I hadn't already been running half his department for years while he played golf with the regional director. I didn't argue then, and I wasn't going to argue now. Instead, I opened the second page of my notebook and started drawing the plant from memory. Every line, every furnace, every conveyor. I marked the weak points, the ones I'd patched quietly over the years so the executives could keep pretending the place ran smooth. The coolant system that required manual resets no one else remembered. The sensor array that threw false alarms unless you adjusted the calibration code buried 3 menus deep. The conveyor relay that only worked if you bypassed a failed safety switch. I wrote them all down, not because I needed reminders, but because I wanted a record. Proof that my so-called lack of readiness was the only thing keeping this entire operation from collapsing. By the afternoon, messages started pouring into my personal email. Some from guys on the floor who had my address, others from office staff who'd been looped into the fallout. Words like shut down, emergency meeting, and system failure popped up again and again. I didn't reply to any of them. Silence was my weapon. Let them feel the weight of it. That night, I logged into the plant's remote monitoring system. They'd forgotten I still had access. Old credentials they never thought to disable. The graphs told the story better than any call or email could. Production was down 40%. Energy usage was spiking. Scrap rates had doubled. Every metric screamed chaos. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just wrote it all down, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. Documentation had always been my strength, and now it was my shield. By the time I closed my laptop, I knew two things. First, the plant wouldn't survive another week like this. Second, when they came crawling back, and they would, I wasn't going to waste my breath with explanations. I would let the evidence speak. My silence would be the loudest answer they'd ever hear. By the third morning, the calls slowed down, but the emails multiplied. Most of them weren't frantic anymore. They were desperate. "Mike, we need you on site. Mike, please respond. The regional director is asking where you are." Their tone had shifted from commands to pleading. I stayed silent. Instead, I drove past the plant, slow and careful, keeping my truck a few blocks away so nobody spotted me. From where I parked, I could see the smokestacks against the sky. Normally, a steady plume mint production was on track. That day, the air was jagged with starts and stops, furnaces shutting down, restarting, then choking again. Even from a distance, I could sense the rhythm was broken. Back home, I opened the notebook again. I listed the incidents I knew about from the remote system and the messages. Conveyor downtime, 6 hours. Furnace restart attempts, 14. Missed shipment deadlines, 3. All high-value contracts. The numbers didn't lie. Every detail I'd carried in my head for 12 years was now unraveling in front of them. That evening, I got an email from Carl. Not one of his usual clipped lines, but 3 full paragraphs. He wrote that the board was watching the situation closely, that production numbers were catastrophic, and that if there was ever a time to prove your leadership, this is it. I read it twice, then shut the laptop. The man who had told me I wasn't ready for promotion now wanted me to prove my leadership by bailing him out. That was his mistake, thinking my silence was a negotiation tactic. It wasn't. It was a decision. Later that night, I checked the remote monitoring again. Metrics were worse. Scrap rate nearly triple. Overtime costs skyrocketing. And then something I hadn't expected. The safety log showed 2 near-miss incidents in the past 12 hours. Both preventable. Both tied to the shortcuts I'd been quietly managing for years. Without my adjustments, the whole system was dangerous. That's when I realized this wasn't just about chaos. It was about liability. The kind of failures that triggered investigations, lawsuits, even shutdown orders. They didn't just need me back. They needed me to protect them from consequences they couldn't handle. I wrote another line in the notebook. Liability is leverage. The next morning, a letter arrived at my apartment. Hand-delivered, not mailed. My name typed across the envelope. Inside, a formal request to return to the plant immediately. Not signed by Carl this time, but by the regional director himself. The language was sharp, almost threatening. Failure to comply could result in termination, it said. Termination. As if I was the one who couldn't survive without them. I folded the letter neatly and slid it under the notebook. Then I picked up my pen and wrote one more word on the page, underlined twice. Wait. The letter from the regional director sat on my table all night. Its sharp words were meant to intimidate, but to me, it read like proof. Proof they were drowning. Proof they couldn't last without me. Termination didn't scare me. I'd already seen what life looked like outside those walls. Quiet mornings, clean air, no alarms dragging me out of bed at 2 in the morning. They thought the threat of losing a paycheck would break me. They didn't understand what I'd already decided. I wasn't playing their game anymore. The next morning, I drove to the plant again, this time closer. I parked in the lot of a closed diner across the street. From there, I watched as trucks lined up at the loading dock. One by one, they pulled away empty. The drivers weren't waiting anymore. The company's reputation was burning down in real time, and I was the only one who could see the full picture. I flipped open the notebook and made another entry. 3 shipments lost today. Estimated penalties, 6 figures. Every number on that page was ammunition, each detail a nail in the coffin of Carl's decision to call me not ready. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. A new number this time. I let it ring, then checked the voicemail. The voice belonged to the plant's safety officer. He said the board wanted an independent review of recent incidents. He asked if I could provide documentation of my past adjustments, my temporary fixes, his words. That message told me more than he realized. They were already preparing for fallout. If regulators got wind of those near-miss incidents, the fines alone could crush them. And I was the only person with detailed records of what had been happening for years. I didn't call him back. Instead, I pulled out the flash drive I kept in a locked drawer. Years of logs, repair notes, calibration changes. Every adjustment I'd made to keep the plant running while management ignored the cracks in the system. I plugged it into my laptop, copied the files, and labeled the folder one word: proof. That night, the desperation reached a new level. Carl showed up at my apartment. I saw his car through the blinds before he even knocked. I didn't answer the door. He stood there for 5 minutes, knocking, calling my name, then finally left. My phone lit up with his voicemail. He said the board was demanding results, that the plant couldn't take another day like this, that it was time for me to step up. Step up. That was his phrase. The same man who had denied me promotion now wanted me to rescue him with silence and obedience. He still didn't understand. I wasn't stepping up. I was letting the truth step forward for me. Before bed, I wrote one more line in the notebook: pressure builds best in silence. The morning after Carl showed up at my door, the messages turned into something different. No longer just pleas for me to return. They were requests for records, data, explanations. It was clear someone on the board had finally realized the truth. Without documentation, without proof of how the plant had been kept alive, they were defenseless. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, the flash drive in front of me. It contained 12 years of quiet fixes, workarounds, and warnings that management had ignored. Each log entry, each timestamp was a blade sharp enough to cut through every excuse they could offer. They didn't just need me. They needed what I'd been carrying in silence all these years. Around mid-morning, another envelope arrived. This one by courier. Inside was a letter written in language that was careful, almost deferential. It didn't demand my return, it invited it. The board, it said, would consider a reassessment of my role if I came in to clarify certain technical matters. They were softening. The arrogance was cracking. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the folder on my laptop labeled proof. I began compiling, not just the raw logs, but summaries, graphs that showed how often I had prevented system failures, charts of downtime avoided because I'd stepped in after hours, reports I had drafted but never sent because Carl had dismissed them as too detailed. For the first time, I was building a narrative. Not angry words, not accusations, just data. Cold, unarguable data. By evening, I had a complete packet. 78 pages, time-stamped, cross-referenced, undeniable. I printed one copy and slid it into a plain folder. On the front, in black marker, I wrote, "For the board." The next day, I drove back to the plant. Not inside, just near enough to see the parking lot overflowing with cars. Emergency meetings were happening. The place looked like a sinking ship with everyone scrambling for buckets. I parked a few blocks away, rolled down my window, and listened to the faint sound of machinery groaning inside. Before I left, I dropped the folder into a FedEx box. Overnight delivery. Straight to the corporate office. No note, no explanation. Just the proof. That night, as I sat in the dark of my living room, my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time. A text, short and sharp, from an unfamiliar number. "We received your package. Call me immediately." I didn't call. I didn't even reply. I just turned the phone face down and wrote in the notebook. Silence speaks loudest when the truth is undeniable. By the time the board received my package, the tone shifted completely. The silence on their end lasted less than 12 hours. Then the storm hit. The first call came from Carl, though his voice was different now. Gone was the clipped authority. He sounded hollow, stretched thin. He said the board had questions, that they wanted me in front of them, that it was my chance to explain everything. He framed it like an opportunity, but his desperation bled through every word. I didn't pick up. I just let the voicemail sit there, another record in my growing collection. An hour later, a different call. This time from a corporate number I recognized from the letterhead. The regional director himself. His voice was controlled, but only just. He mentioned that the packet I'd sent had raised serious concerns at the executive level. He said the board was convening an emergency session. He asked me, politely, almost carefully, to attend. I wrote one word in my notebook: leverage. That evening, the local news ran a story. A short piece, buried after the weather. Production issues at local steel plant sparked questions. Just a minute long, but enough to confirm what I already knew. Their failure wasn't contained anymore. It was spilling out. Contracts were collapsing. Clients were asking questions. The story wouldn't die down. It would grow. I checked the monitoring system again. One furnace offline completely. Conveyor downtime climbing. Scrap rate at record levels. Every graph on my screen was another nail in Carl's coffin. Then came the email. Direct from the board's chairwoman. Short, precise. We have received your documentation. It raises questions of mismanagement at the supervisory level. We request your presence at the board meeting on Thursday. Mismanagement at the supervisory level. That phrase told me everything. They weren't just looking at the plant's problems anymore. They were looking at Carl. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. For the first time, I felt the weight shift. It wasn't on me anymore. It was on them. The next morning, Carl showed up at my apartment again. I didn't open the door. From the window, I saw him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. His movements were sharp, frantic, like a man who knew the ground beneath him was breaking apart. He stayed for 10 minutes, then left quickly, tires squealing as he pulled away. I picked up my pen and wrote in the notebook, the board doesn't need an explanation. They need a replacement. For 12 years, I had been the silent foundation holding that place together. Now, my silence was letting the cracks show. And once they saw the truth, they'd have no choice but to remove the man who told me I wasn't ready. Thursday arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that carries a weight of inevitability. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., but I never planned to attend. That wasn't my role anymore. My job was to let silence do what words never could. At 9:15, the first voicemail came in. Carl again, his voice ragged, telling me the board was asking pointed questions about why safety procedures had been ignored, why near-miss incidents hadn't been reported, why downtime had been hidden from quarterly reports. He said my name had come up. He begged me to come in and set the record straight. At 9:40, another call, this time from the regional director's assistant. She said the meeting had turned hostile. The board had reviewed my packet, and now they were demanding explanations Carl couldn't provide. She asked if I could clarify the technical data. I didn't answer. At 10:03, my phone lit up again. A short text, not from Carl or the director, but from an unknown number. He's done. Call me. I didn't call. I didn't need to. The silence had already delivered the verdict. By noon, I knew the outcome without a single official word. The plant's monitoring system told the story. Access permissions shifted. Carl's credentials were revoked. A new administrator profile appeared, board level. That was how companies spoke when things changed. Quietly, but permanently. I sat back in my chair, staring at the graphs on my laptop. For 12 years, I'd been the one patching holes in their system, carrying their failures on my back. And for 2 weeks, I had let the silence widen those cracks until the whole structure collapsed on the man who thought I wasn't ready. That afternoon, a courier arrived with another envelope. Heavy paper, gold seal. This one wasn't a threat or a plea. It was an invitation. The board wanted to meet, not as a reprimand, but as a consultation. Your expertise is essential to the plant's future, the letter read. We would like to discuss a new role, effective immediately. I placed the letter on the table, beside the notebook and the flash drive. 3 objects that told the entire story. Silence. Proof. Power. For the first time, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Not because I had won some argument. Not because Carl had been cut down. But because the truth had spoken louder than I ever could, and I hadn't raised my voice once. Before I closed the notebook that night, I wrote one final line on the page. Quiet men don't beg for respect. They take it, one silence at a time. The meeting with the board was set for Monday morning, in a glass-walled conference room I'd never been inside during my 12 years at the plant. I arrived early, not because I wanted to, but because I had learned long ago that walking in calm and prepared was more powerful than being dragged in late. The board members filed in slowly, expensive suits and practiced smiles, but their eyes gave them away. They weren't looking at me like a problem anymore. They were looking at me like an answer. The chairwoman opened the meeting with a simple statement. The plant's performance over the past 2 weeks had been untenable. She said the data I provided painted a picture of systemic neglect and failures in leadership. She didn't mention Carl by name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. I didn't interrupt. I didn't thank her. I let the silence stretch until someone else filled it with nervous shifting, the rustle of papers, the clearing of a throat. Silence had weight in that room, and I let it work for me. When they finally turned to me for comment, I slid the flash drive across the table. "Everything you need is there," I said quietly. That was all. No speech. No accusations. Just evidence. They plugged it in. Charts, logs, repair notes, all organized with precision. The same attention to detail that had kept the plan alive was now dismantling the illusion of stability they'd believed in for years. One director whispered something about liability. Another muttered about insurance. Their words bounced around the table, but I stayed silent. Finally, the chairwoman asked the question they had all been circling around. What would it take to stabilize operations? I paused, not because I needed time to think, but because silence makes people lean forward. Then I answered with the truth. Authority, resources, and freedom from interference. The room went still. They were expecting negotiations, maybe demands for money or titles. What I gave them was structure. A clear, unshakable outline of what it would take to keep their investment from collapsing. They asked if I would take over as plant manager. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just said, if the conditions are met. By the time I left that room, the decision was made. Carl was finished. The board had no illusions left, and the plant's future rested in the hands of the man they had once dismissed as not ready. Back in my apartment that evening, I wrote a final note in the notebook. Silence isn't absence. Silence is presence amplified. The proof was there. The board had heard me without me ever raising my voice. The following week, I walked back into the plant. Not through the side entrance where supervisors usually came in, but through the front doors, past reception, into the heart of the building. Heads turned as I passed. Some men lowered their eyes. Others stared openly. No one spoke. The board's announcement had gone out that morning. I was the new plant manager, effective immediately. Carl's name wasn't mentioned. It didn't need to be. Everyone already knew he was gone. The air on the floor was different. Tense, watchful. Crews worked slower, glancing at me as I moved past them. They weren't sure if I'd come back with anger or vengeance, or a list of names to punish. I gave them none of that. I said nothing, just observed. Silence, once again, did the work for me. In the control room, I stood in front of the monitors, the same ones I had watched for years in the shadows. Now, the operators shifted nervously in their chairs, waiting for orders. I didn't bark commands. I didn't lecture. I just pointed at the graphs, the rising scrap rate, the cooling inefficiency, the conveyor stoppages. They nodded quickly, writing notes, scrambling to catch up. They were realizing what I had always known. Every problem they faced had been cushioned by my quiet corrections. Without me, the cracks widened. By the second day, things began to shift. Crews straightened up when I entered. Meetings started on time. Reports came in without excuses. Not because I demanded it, but because they feared what my silence meant. They didn't want to be the subject of the next line in my notebook. The board checked in daily at first, their voices cautious, careful. They asked if operations were stabilizing. I gave them short answers. Numbers, percentages, production figures. No stories, no opinions. The silence between my words carried more weight than any speech Carl had ever made. By the end of the week, production was climbing again. Not perfect, but steady. Shipments moved out. Trucks returned. Clients stopped calling every hour. The storm was passing, slowly. One evening, I walked the floor alone after everyone had gone home. The machines hummed steadily. The furnaces glowed. The conveyor belts carried steel like blood through veins. It struck me then. This place had always been mine. I'd been running it in silence for years. The title was just a formality. Back at my apartment, I opened the notebook one more time. I wrote, "Respect isn't asked for. It's built. Brick by silent brick." The men at the plant had started to understand that. The board understood it now. And soon, the entire company would. 2 months later, the plant was running smoother than it had in years. The numbers spoke louder than any report. Production up 12%, scrap reduced by half, shipments back on schedule. Clients who had threatened to pull contracts were now extending them. The board congratulated itself in hushed tones, but everyone on the floor knew the truth. They didn't thank me openly. They didn't need to. Their silence when I passed, the way they straightened their backs, the speed with which they carried out instructions, that was acknowledgement enough. Respect, real respect, doesn't come in applause. It comes in the quiet weight of fear and trust blended together. Carl disappeared. No one mentioned him. Rumors said he'd been offered a transfer, but I knew better. Men like him don't get new offices. They get erased. One evening, I stayed late in my office, overlooking the floor. Through the glass, I saw the crews shutting down for the night, machines cooling, sparks fading. It reminded me of the first time I realized this place lived or died on the silent adjustments I'd made. Back then, I'd been dismissed as not ready. Now, my silence had carried me to the top. The board still called sometimes, asking for updates, but the tone had shifted permanently. They didn't order anymore. They asked, and my answers were short. Numbers, timelines, projections. I gave them no more than they needed, because silence was still my most valuable currency. At home, the notebook sat nearly full. Page after page of observations, calculations, and single, sharp lines that marked each turning point. On the last page, I wrote, "The quiet man doesn't fight for a seat at the table. He builds the table and lets others realize they've been eating off it all along." That night, I closed the notebook for the final time. I didn't need to write more. The proof was all around me, in the steady hum of the plant, in the nervous respect of the workers, in the board's careful words. Some men shout to prove their worth. Others scheme. But I had shown them what silence could do. Silence had dismantled a supervisor. Silence had forced a board to kneel. Silence had rebuilt an entire operation. And when the day came that someone else doubted me again, I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't plead. I would do exactly what I had done here. Step back, say nothing, and let silence speak louder than any voice. Because I hadn't won by raising mine. I had won by never needing to. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.